2004. So the year when Kanye's Graduation drops, iMac computers have those stupid colored plastic backs, and Darlene Druyan enters a plea deal, which is my segue to the topic. Darlene Druyan in 2004 is the US Air Force's chief procurement officer, and she's forced by the Justice Department to enter a plea deal because, as it turns out, while she was negotiating a multi-billion-dollar non-competitive contract with Boeing, she was also negotiating a future job with Boeing, and she negotiated for Boeing to create a fake job for her daughter and her daughter's husband, which makes her not just hilariously corrupt, but also the coolest mother-in-law ever. Darlene Druyan ends up going to jail and fired from her job and is spending the rest of her life, I don't know where, but presumably in disgrace. I want to then fast forward 3 years to 2007. So we're getting ready for the 2008 election, and Digital Fusion, which is a major defense contractor, not as big as Boeing, which is one of the top 5, but still considerable, executives from Digital Fusion show up to a campaign breakfast to the House Intelligence Committee chairman, Sylvester Reyes, at this fancy restaurant in Texas where he's running. And they hand him a $24,000 check, and they shake his hand, and photographs are taken. And the Wall Street Journal runs this like breathless article, like, corruption in the appropriations process. And they're like, yes, but it's not corruption because it's a campaign. So that means that obviously there can be no corruption in this instance. And Sylvester Reyes goes on, by the way, this $24,000 check came less than a month and a half after Reyes had directed a non-competitive bid for $2.6 million to Digital Fusion for repairs to a base in his district that never actually happened. So the difference between these two is that Darlene Druyan was not running for political office. Sylvester Reyes was, which gives him bigger protections under campaign finance law because in the context of campaigning, corruption has a very different meaning. So I'm going to be talking specifically about how the defense industry specifically uses money to get its way in the appropriations process. I'm going to briefly go through just some of the more important Supreme Court cases to give you an idea of the legal background, to just briefly go through Citizens United. Then we're going to talk about some empirical data. I'll talk about math in non-mathematical terms, some results, and then considerations for future research and discussion. So modern campaign finance jurisprudence really starts with the Buckley v. Vallejo case in 1976. You don't need to know the details of what happened in these. What's important is that in Buckley, the court holds that contributing money is in fact speech, that it's protected under the First Amendment. Now, obviously, speech is not unlimited. There's all sorts of reasons the government can and does restrict speech for public safety, slander, libel, so on and so forth. So fast forward to 1990, I'm skipping a lot of cases in the interest of time, by the way. Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce, in which the Supreme Court holds it's not just in cases of quid pro quo, where like Bank of America gives $1 million to the head of the finance committee, and then the finance committee just like makes Bank of America the national mascot. But it's also a general systemic corruption, that if there's a corruption of incentives and ends, that it's not just about specific details, but that corruption can be system-wide. And that's Austin's big contribution. Now, it's this view that corruption can either be quid pro quo in specific instances or more systemic that's advocated by scholars like Zephyr Teachout, which is the coolest name I've ever heard for an academic. She's this Harvard professor who actually tried to run for office in the last midterms in Massachusetts and didn't win, ironically, because she didn't have enough money. She hates campaign finance and the corruption that goes along with it. So those are the two considerations about how campaign finance can be restricted as speech when there's a compelling government interest in preventing corruption of the electoral process. Fast forward 20 more years, Citizens United, which is fundamentally a case about the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002. It's commonly known as McCain-Feingold, which restricted the ability of independent corporations and individuals to contribute to independent organizations like PACs that aren't a campaign in the amount that they can donate. Citizens United holds that those bans are unconstitutional. The court under Roberts and Kennedy argues that contributing to like a PAC that supports a candidate but isn't affiliated with them cannot create a quid pro quo sense of corruption. In that sense, they're overturning Austin in that corruption is no longer included under a systemic framework of corruption. There's also a second case, Speech Now, or Speech Now, because there's an exclamation point, versus FEC, and that's about how unlimited contributions also have to be considered constitutional. That's often overlooked, but it's usually considered part and parcel of the Citizens United decision. So a lot of the debate over this by scholars like Teachout and others, Torres Spellisy, focuses on a legalistic perspective. When these analyses of the actual impact of the decision come around, they tend to be anecdotal if they use empirical arguments instead of legal frameworks at all. So what I wanted to do was take a more quantitative approach to see what the actual impact was. And quantitative approaches have been interesting so far, but they haven't been very robust. I'll give you an example. Going back to the Adams Syria presentation, MapLight, which is an NGO in DC in September 2013, comes out with this study when the US is voting for airstrikes on Syria based on the chemical weapons attack. Those Congress people who voted for strikes received 83% more money from the defense industry than those who voted against. Now that sounds like corruption, but here's the problem, is that if you're Lockheed Martin, pretend that you're the largest defense contractor in the world. It's an incredible feeling of power. If you're Lockheed Martin and you have all this money to donate, like millions of dollars per election cycle, you're going to direct that money not to the Dennis Kuciniches of the world, you're going to direct it to the John McCains of the world, which makes it really hard to isolate the effect of the money on changing legislative behavior. So the MapLight study, for example, is interesting, but it's not enough to establish causality. So with that in mind, what I tried to do was use the increase in campaign funding post-Citizens United as a sort of exogenous event, which for non-stat people means it's something that happens that allows you to isolate something else. So for example, you can look at legislative behavior before Citizens United and how much money they received from the defense industry, and then you can look at it after and see the increase, and then at that point the ideology of the individual representative controls for themselves. Like John McCain did not suddenly become more warlike between 2008 and 2012. He's still John McCain. So looking at that, Citizens United becomes the way to isolate this effect. So for the data, I use FEC data, which is compiled by the Sunlight Foundation. They do really good work on political corruption and specifically the statistical impacts. You can also use the Sunlight Foundation's website to isolate per sector. So you can literally just like click a representative, a race, or an election cycle, and then it'll show you how much money they received from the defense industry. For the response variable, I use the National Defense Authorization Act votes of fiscal year 2013. The NDAA that year was just a massive gift basket to the defense industry. There were literally like hundreds of drones and thousands of tanks that the military actively said they didn't want, but Congress was like, no, Boeing wants them, so you're gonna get them, figure out where to put them. Obviously, this is a little bit of a weak response variable. This study is more exploratory on future research, which I'll get to later. And obviously, there's a lot that goes into an individual legislator's decision to vote on an individual case. I also use ideology and partisanship. I adjust for that using the DW nominate scale. That's what Nate Silver uses, so you know it has to be pretty good. The DW nominate scale basically ranks legislators based on how liberal or how conservative they are. And as it turns out, ideology and partisanship are hilariously non-significant. For those of you with stat background, the R squared for ideology is 0.00934, which means that ideology explains less than 1% of legislators' vote on the NDAA. So going off of this, some results. For the 2012 campaign race, opponents, those who voted against the NDAA, received about $66,400 on average from the defense industry, $66,000. Supporters received on average $168,000. Now, obviously, that's pretty impressive that you're receiving over $100,000 more from the defense industry if you voted for. But again, you get back to the problem of like, what if I was already favorable towards the defense industry? So what I looked at was the increase. Of those who voted against the NDAA, saw an average increase from 2008 to 2012, over which Citizens United occurred, of $32,629, so $32,600. Supporters saw an average increase of $62,292. That means that if you voted for the NDAA, you saw an increase between those 2 years, approximately double those who voted against. So that's pretty impressive. So considering some of the things about future research, obviously the big weakness of this analysis is that we're not looking at behavior before and after. I didn't feel it was right to use the NDAA of say 2008 or 2009. because the bills were so vastly different. You saw sequestration during that time, the politics changed radically. So I've actually submitted a grant proposal to my university, I'll find out in the next week or two, to construct an index of an individual legislator's behavior and favorability towards the defense industry. No such data set occurs, which means that researchers are really set looking at individual bills that don't provide a common framework for analysis. And then hopefully I'll be able to publish a more robust study and also publish that data set for other research. So using a defense industry favorability rating would obviously, that's what I'm calling the variable in my proposal, sounds academic, would obviously allow for a more robust and more interesting comparison. I also want to add the 2006 and 2014 campaigns to get what a midterm would look like. When I first did this paper, the 2014 midterms hadn't happened, which made analysis really hard. So incorporating those would be really interesting as well to get more data on representatives, to get 33 additional senators who are running in those campaigns. So that's where I'm going, hopefully, in the future with this project. I want to finish with one concluding thought on the broader legalistic, political, and moral discussion of this. In the Citizens United decision, Kennedy and Roberts and the other 3 justices voting in favor didn't just say that campaign finance is not speech when it creates corruption. They also said that it's not speech when it creates corruption, or the crucial 5 words, or the appearance of corruption. And this is something that goes back through the last 40 years of campaign finance jurisprudence, that almost every Supreme Court decision actually has held that when it looks like corruption, the deleterious impact that has on American citizens' confidence and faith in government is enough to justify restricting that funding, even when no corruption can be proven to exist. And I spent a lot of nights on Espresso looking at, box and whisker plots and logit regression outputs, which it'll put you to sleep. But when you really start looking at it, it looks a whole lot like corruption. So whether that has any legal meaning or whether that has any political meaning, a more empirical and quantitative approach to the actual impact of the changes of Citizens United, I think, plays a much larger role in the legalistic perspectives than is often taken into account.
Thank you.